want to thank you for inviting me here to be with you tonight. It's a blessing to me and a pleasure. Let's open this session with prayer, if you will. Almighty God, Creator of all mercies, we, your faithful servants, do give you our most respectful and cheerful thanks for all your goodness and loving kindness that you have given to us. We, although we are your unworthy servants, we ask that you to walk with us and to guide us as we follow your light. Keep us in the way of righteousness and prevent us from falling into the way of darkness. For you are the way, the truth, and the life. And you are the light that shines within each and one of your children. Amen. In Matthew 10, verses 5 through 7, Jesus sent his apostles out to minister to the lost tribes of Israel. And if you remember from the story told in 2 Kings, the 12 tribes of Israel have become scattered. And so when Jesus told them in Matthew, he said, go out and find these lost sheep and bring them back into the fold. And then we find that in Matthew 28, verse 19, just right before his ascension, Jesus told those that were gathered before him that day, he said, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now look at what's changed between Jesus' earlier proclamation of Matthew 10 and Matthew 28. Matthew 10, he says, go find the lost sheep of Israel and minister to them. In Matthew 28, right before he goes to heaven, he says, go out and go to all nations. That includes Gentiles, Jews, and everybody. And so we know from reading the New Testament, they did go out. And we know that having been given the gift of speaking languages in the tongues of other nations, they were able to go out and communicate with people with different tongues of languages all over the world. But the question we ask is, where did they go? Now the scriptures tell us a little bit about where the apostles went, but they don't tell us everything. Eusebius, who was a bishop of Caesarea, that's an area just a little bit north of Jerusalem, he attended the Council of Nicaea in 325, and he authored what's considered the definitive early history of Christianity. It's called the Ecclesiastical History. And he says that the apostles divided the world and set forth to all points of the compass. And so he tells us, for example, that Andrew, the first apostle called, traveled to Scythia, Byzantium, India, and Armenia. Andrew also traveled frequently in the company of Thomas and Matthias. Jude, who Matthew and Mark called Thaddeus, ministered in Armenia as well. Irenaeus, who was a bishop in the Gallican church, that's a Celtic church on continental Europe, late in the 2nd century, tells us that Matthew ministered among the Hebrews. We didn't say where. Hebrews, lost tribes, could have been anywhere in Europe or Asia. Clement of Alexandria, though, tells us that he writes that Matthew spent 15 years ministering to the people in Africa and Ethiopia. James, the son of Zebedee, ministered in Spain to the Jewish slaves that the Romans had brought there to build their roads. James the Less went with Luke, who was one of the 70, and ministered in the Holy Land around Jerusalem. Luke spent most of his time in Antioch where he had family. Mark was a cousin of Barnabas and Aristobulus. Mark was also one of the 70 along with Luke. He traveled with Paul and Barnabas and went to Antioch where they all ministered together. Mark also ministered in the early churches in Cyprus, in Turkey, and then later went to North Africa where he established the church in Alexandria, which went on to be one of the most influential early churches. Then there was Peter. Roman had you believe that he just went immediately to Rome after the crucifixion and the ascension and put a little pointy hat on his head and sat there and pontificated for 30 years before they killed him. Well, that's not true. Peter liked to travel. Peter spent 7 years in Antioch as bishop, and then he went into Asia Minor, Samaria, Caesarea, and Jerusalem. Eusebius also tells us that Peter liked to travel with Philip, and he says that he worked a lot with Philip in Gaul, which is pretty much present-day France, ministering to the churches that Philip had established there. Barnabas also ministered, although not one of the 12, he also ministered in Antioch with Peter. John moved to Ephesus, which is located in Turkey. It's also a Celtic province. He moved there shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem, where he founded a church that Paul and Timothy would also minister to. Matthias was a follower of John the Baptist along with Andrew and John. Matthias, when he went traveling with Andrew, ministered in Jerusalem, Judea, Damascus, and Armenia. Now, what you can see from what I've told you, I've not covered all the apostles, I just want to give you a little bit of a sample, that we know from the early church fathers, and particularly Eusebius and some others, where they went and what they did. And you can see that they traveled broadly throughout the Roman Empire, spreading the gospel. So we've got to ask ourselves, okay, we know they traveled. Eusebius says they go to the 4 points of the compass, but did any of them make it to Britain? And then you ask, well, why would they go to Britain? What's special about Britain? Well, first of all, Britain was a part of the Roman Empire. Its Celtic name, by the way, was Albion. Perhaps you know that. There were well-established trading routes across Gaul, present-day France, that went into Cornwall and Avalon, where present-day Glastonbury is. And these trading routes were set up because they mined tin in Cornwall. The Romans needed this tin to mix with the copper they got in Cyprus to make bronze to go in to the making of their weaponry, their spears and swords. In fact, the Romans called Britain the Ten Islands. But it wasn't the Romans who first established this trading route and discovered the tin. It was the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians settled a route through the ocean up through the Veronese province, and they landed in Massilia. Massilia is what we know today as Marseille in southern France. There were good Roman roads across France, or Gaul in those days, that took you right across France and over the shore, where they would cross the channel and go into Cornwall and mine their tin, and then bring it back through France on pack mules. Joseph of Arimathea was a merchant who made this, traveled this route many, many times to buy tin and to take it back and sell it to the Romans. Now, I've got a map here. I don't know if it'll show up well or not, but I'm going to show you some of the things that we're going to be talking about here tonight. Now, if you look at this area right in here, this is Old Phoenicia. Old Phoenicia is basically what Lebanon is today. So the Phoenicians follow this route around here, stop off in Italy for food and supplies, and come in right here in the Venoise province in southern Gaul, or France, near the port of Massilia, which we know as Marseille. This section right here, here's Ephesus. Over here is Antioch. This section right in here is Cornwall. Up here is Wales. And right below this little split right in here is Avalon, or Glastonbury. So keep these in mind as we go through this tonight, and we'll talk about the folks who traveled this route. Now, oftentimes what we're exposed to is what I call the Roman version of history. Roman version in that Rome has pretty much written all the history books. So if you look up in these history books, even church history books, and you want to ask the question, when did Christianity come to Britain? You know what they'll tell you? The 6th century. Christianity didn't make it to Britain until the 6th century. They'll tell you that Christianity came to Scotland in the 4th century by way of a fellow named Ninian, who we know very well in the Celtic Church. And this one person just evangelized and Christianized the whole country of Scotland. And then, about 50 years later, the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope, sent some fellow named Patrick into Ireland. And Patrick chased all the snakes out. You know the story. enamored the local Druids and the Celtic people with his little clover to explain the Trinity, and it's all converted to Christianity. One person converted the whole island of Ireland. And then they say about a century later, notice this is running at about 100-year times, the 4th century, 5th century, now we're up to the 6th century. And all of a sudden in the 6th century, this Irish church, which by the way is Catholic because of Patrick, came into Britain and Christianized Britain. Now, what's wrong with that story is a lot of things. First of all, Patrick wasn't sent by the Pope or Bishop of Rome. Patrick was sent by the Bishop of the Gallican or Celtic Church in Gaul. And in fact, the bishops in the Gallican Church had sent many people before Patrick that Rome doesn't talk about, doesn't know. I mean, many. I can't even name them all. Palladius is the most famous besides Patrick, because they were trying to Christianize Ireland. And by the way, it wasn't just the Gallican Church. The church in Northern Africa was sending missions there too. You had two churches working on Ireland at the same time. The fact is, Patrick didn't know the Pope, and the Pope didn't know Patrick. Now, how do we know that? Rome says he did. We know it because if you just fast forward a few years later, you find in the letters when Augustine comes to Canterbury, and his name is Augustine, not Augustine, his letters to the Bishop of Rome, Gregory, survive to this day. And he clearly tells us they didn't know Christianity was in Britain. He's surprised. We come here to establish Christian missions, and guess what? There's churches here, Pope. And the Pope writes back and says, I didn't know that. And then another letter, Augustine says, well, they're different from us. They got different ways. And the Pope says, well, if you find anything useful, bring it back. We might could use it. And this is a conversation. It's well recorded. A few years later, after Rome has set its mission there in Britain, there's a whole series of councils that lead up to the Synod of Whitby. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the British church to come under the Roman church. And the essence of it is, what comes out in these council meetings is, we're just too different to do anything. But they sign joint proclamations together. And so you'll find at the Council of Augustine Oaks at the Severn River in 603, you find the Roman Church admitting that they did not establish any Christianity in Britain before the mission of Augustine. And in fact, the Roman Church admits that the British Church did in fact come out of Jerusalem. Now, if that's not bad enough, when Rome tells a story about how Christianity came into Britain, they talk about people like St. Columba, who founded the big monastery at Auna, and some other fellow named Cuthbert, who founded a well-known monastery at Listenfarn. And to us in the Celtic Church, right there, just using those names, we know something's wrong with the picture, don't we? And what's wrong with the picture is this. Columba is a Roman name. It's not a Gaelic name. The person they're talking about is St. Columcille, who was born in Ireland, and who had an Irish Gaelic name, Columcille. What about this fellow we hear called Cuthbert? Well, think about it. Cuthbert is a Saxon name, right? Now, Listenfarn does happen to be in a Saxon province of Northumbria, but Cuthbert was born in Scotland. So actually, his name's not Cuthbert, it's Cuthbert. It's Gaelic. Spelled C-H-U-I-T-H-B-H-E-I-R-T. I prefer to call him Cuthbert, it's a lot easier to say. But this is just how hokey Roman history is. They tell us these things and people believe them. Philip Newell, as I mentioned, falls into it. He spouts a lot of this type of history in his books. What else is hokey about Roman history? Not to pick on Rome. They say, of course, Peter was there the whole time in Rome being Pope. But at the same time, they recognize during the same time he's supposed to be in Rome, they admit, well, he was also in Antioch. How can that be so? Here's one better than that. They say in the Roman Church, New Advent Encyclopedia, that Peter was martyred in 68 AD. They say Linus, who was a Briton, by the way, and who Eusebius says was actually the first bishop of Rome, Catholic Church says second after Peter, well, they report in their history that Linus was martyred in AD 67, a year before Peter. Now, how can the second bishop of Rome be martyred before the first bishop? You see what I'm getting at with Rome's hokey history? It's not even sloppy. It's not even careful. But yet, that's what's written, and everybody just falls into it and believes it and repeats it and doesn't think about it. The thing about the Irish church coming to Britain is partially true. The Irish church did evangelize Britain. But what they were doing was, by the 6th century, was they were re-Christianizing the British Isle. What happened was, when the Saxons came in, they looted, they burned, they scattered the Celts, as we know, tore the churches down, and created a mess. When things had settled down, Ireland began sending missionaries back into Britain to establish these churches. And what they did in large part was, they put a lot of their churches in Saxon territory, figuring if we can convert the Saxons and tame them down, maybe we'll keep them burning up our stuff. Made sense, didn't it? Which is why you find the great monastery at Listenfarne in a Saxon province of Northumbria. So that part's true. What Rome picks up on is simply the re-Christianization of Britain, where the Saxons destroyed it. Now, I want to make one more comment, although it's a bit off topic here, because it's important. At the time that Ireland, the Irish church, began re-Christianizing Britain, it changed the Celtic church forever. And what I mean by that is this. Prior to the Saxon destruction and the Irish re-Christianization, the Celtic church in Britain was very simple. Most of the worship was in the home. Most of the worship was centered around the agape meal with the Eucharist or Shabbat, that kind of thing. There were a few standalone churches. There were a few. But even then, the liturgy was not unlike the Didache. Very simple, very straightforward, very much taken out of Jerusalem. That's why it was simple. When the Irish church came, you remember me mentioning earlier, Ireland had the influence of two separate churches. The Gallican church in Gaul was sending missions there. North African church came in. They were sending people there to Christianize Ireland. Rome had nothing to do with it. What they got in the Irish church from the North African church was the monastic model, where they had monasteries and abbots that became teaching centers. What they got from the Gallican church was wearing fancy robes and heavy liturgy, nice long flowing liturgy. So when they brought this into Britain and reestablished churches, guess what the British church got? They got the monastic model and they got the heavy liturgical model. And that's what the British church became, although there were still parts of Britain that still used the old, simpler model. If you remember the Book of Deer in the 11th century, it describes a Celtic clergy's dress. Remember? Colorful. Remember that? If you read it, very colorful, overlays. Well, that's where it came from. It came from the Irish church, the Irish influence. So when Ireland re-Christianized the British Isles, they changed the church forever. And these guys have heard me say many times, you know, when people talk about the Celtic church, I say, well, what time period are we talking about? We ask what it was like. What time period? And where? Talking about the Irish church, Scottish church, the British church, the French church, the Gaelic church, because they're all different. And they vary from time to time because of these different influences. Now, having said that, what we do is we discount the Roman version of history. And we look elsewhere to find out the answer to the question is, well, if we know the apostles traveled all over the Roman Empire spreading the gospel, wouldn't it make sense that some of them might come to Britain? Now, of course, we know Rome says no, but they have these long established trading routes. And so we ask ourselves, was there any Christians, were there any churches in the British Isles before Rome says they were in the 6th century? And so what we do is we discount Roman history and we look elsewhere. A number of patristic fathers, early fathers, I just call them early church writers. Lump them all in one category. They have different, patristic era and the church father era, etc. But a lot of early church writers have written, in fact, there was Christianity in Britain. And this is why I have my notes, but I only got some quotes. I can't remember these anymore at my age. So I'm going to read some quotes to you that'll support this. All we have on the one hand is Rome saying, nope, Wasn't no Christians there till our Irish church came and brought Christianity in the 6th century to that heathen country. That's what they call England, the heathen country. But listen to this. Theophilus, who was a bishop of Antioch in 180 AD, he says that shortly after Pentecost, the apostles scattered going into parts of the whole world, including the great continent, that's Europe, and others went northward into Britain. Pretty straightforward, Britain. Britain, by the way, was the Roman term for the island. We call it Albion. Tertullian, I've got a little book of his at home that's got some of his sermons in it. They're quite, the guy should have been, he's a Pentecostal before his time, but Bishop of Carthage in North Africa, he wrote in 197, "The name of Christ has reached the various confines of the Moors, all the limits of Spain, the diverse nations of Gaul, and the haunts of Britain." Now, Gaul, as we said, was basically France, little, a bit of Switzerland, some other countries. The Moors were the Berber tribes in North Africa, the people that Mark was down there ministering to. He's talking about Mark's mission. Isidore, Archbishop of Seville, from 600 to 636. He says that Philip and Paul both came to Gaul. That rhymes. In the area around Marseilles, present-day Marseilles, Marseille back then. And he says that Peter was with them. In this area, all three of them preached the gospel. Cardinal Cesare Baronius, he was a Roman Catholic. He was curator of the Vatican Library and twice almost elected Pope. He authored a religious work called Annales Ecclesiastes on the history of the church. Church scholars say it's second only in importance to Eusebius' work, so you can see how important this is. He says in his work that Philip, the apostle, in fact, did come to Gaul and minister there and establish church there. Surprisingly, Bede, the Roman apologist and spinmeister, says also that Philip came to Gaul. Surprising, because he's such a defender of Rome and Roman Christianity. Cardinal Pole, another Roman Catholic, prominent Roman Catholic cardinal, he wrote a letter to the British Parliament in 1555 in which he says Britain was the first of all countries to receive the Christian faith. Now, he's not saying that it's the first place to receive Christianity. He says the first country to receive Christianity, because we know that Jerusalem and Judea was there before Britain. In fact, speaking of the Roman Church, because they now want to deny that Christianity was in Britain before the 6th century, 5 papal councils during the Middle Ages all affirmed that the British Church was older than the Roman Church. At the Council of Pisa in 1409 AD, they confirmed that the British Church took precedence over all other Western churches. Rome's a Western church, by the way, since it was founded out of Jerusalem shortly after the crucifixion of Christ. The Council of Constance in 419 AD, as well as the Council of Siena in 1423, made the same proclamation. At the Council of Basile in 1431, they stated that the Celtic Church took precedence over all other Western churches because it was founded by Joseph of Arimathea immediately after the Passion of Christ. And notice we're saying Western churches because we all know that James's church in Jerusalem was first and established a year ahead of the Celtic Church. And it was James's church that we in the Celtic Church came out of. Eusebius, whom I mentioned earlier as being the definitive early writer of Christian history, said the apostles passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Isles and received the faith during the time of the people in Britain received the faith during the time of the apostles. Now, and there's many, many other quotes. I don't want to be here all night long giving you, I can give you pages of quotes, but I picked some very important ones from diverse people that are very well respected. Now, A lot of times when you look at these early people, if you don't research them, you'll find out that, well, this person was discredited. And I'll mention that the Roman Church tried to discredit Cardinal Baronius after he wrote what he wrote with the Celtic Church. They tried to smear him. But the man's reputation remains impeccable in the minds of church historians. So, we've got a lot of people. As I said, there's a lot more I could quote. Says Christianity came to Britain. So the question we want to get to now is, well, we got a lot of people saying it came there early on after the crucifixion. How did it get there, first of all? And secondly, who brung it? Did any of the apostles bring it? Did any of the 70 bring it? And by the way, you'll hear me call the 70 disciples because they were followers of Christ. And if you read Eusebius' work, you'll find that just about every one of the 70 became a bishop somewhere in the world. They were very important people. So, let's look some more at what some of these early church writers said in that regard. Epiphanius, who was a bishop of Salamius in the 300s, late 4th century, says that Philip came to Gaul with Joseph of Arimathea. He says Philip also preached in Dalmatia, that's present-day Croatia, Gaul, as we said, present-day France, and Italy. And he says that Philip even went into Macedonia, but that he spent most of his time ministering in Gaul. Cardinal Baronius says that after Pentecost, Joseph, speaking of Joseph of Arimathea, gave up his work and joined a team of missionaries led by the Apostle Philip. He says it came to Western Europe, having reached Massilia in Gaul in 35 AD, where they split into two groups. One group stayed around the area of Massilia, Marseille, and ministered. The other group, which was led by Joseph of Arimathea, traveled north. Because of Joseph's familiarity with Britain, he was chosen by Philip, according to Cardinal Baronius, to cross the English Channel and take the gospel to the British people. And so Cardinal Baronius says he takes 11 or 12 associates with him, sails across the north shore of Cornwall, remember I showed you Cornwall on the map, up to Devon, and he lands on the Somerset coast. He goes inward to what we know, what we in the Celtic Church call the Isle of Avalon, or the Glass Isle, present-day Glastonbury, and establishes his first missionary base in the British Isles. Now Joseph wasn't an apostle, and he wasn't one of the 70. But we're told in the scriptures in John 19:38 that he was a secret follower of Jesus. He was a merchant who traveled frequently to Cornwall to buy tin to sell to the Romans so they could make bronze for their swords and spears. We're told in Matthew 27:57 that he was wealthy, and that he also was the uncle of Jesus, meaning he was a great uncle, or uncle of Mary, and meaning he was a great uncle of Jesus. The Jewish Talmud tells us that he was Joseph's, or Mary's father's youngest brother. He must have been an important person because all four Gospels mention him. He's from a town called Arimathea, which is about 8 miles north of Jerusalem. And remember, in the Gospels, when Jesus' body was taken down, he asked to have it, to see to it that it would be buried, to bury it in one of his tombs. Legend says that he brought many relics from the crucifixion to the British Isles. And that can be a topic for another seminar if you guys want to get into that. The Doomsday Book, compiled by Taliesin in 1088 in Britain, says this about Joseph. It says, Joseph's mission to Britain fulfilled a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 43. That verse says this: "The kingdom of God shall be taken away from you and given to a nation, bringing forth the fruits thereof." In other words, what Taliesin was saying is, the Jews rejected Jesus. And so his message of the good news then was taken to the Gentiles. but he was taken to a Gentile nation some 20 years before Paul's outreach to the Gentiles. Isn't that something? St. Gildas the Wise of Wales writes this about Joseph. In his De Accitio Britannia, he says Christianity came to Britain in the last year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius Caesar. That makes it 37 AD. And that lines up with what Cardinal Baronius said coming in the same year to bring it in. Gildas writes this. He said, meanwhile these islands received the beams of light, that is the holy precepts of Christ, the true Son, at the latter part, as we know, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Cardinal Baronius writes in his Ecclesiastical Annals, he said, in that year, speaking of AD 36, the party of Joseph Arimathea and those who went with him into exile were put out to sea in a vessel without oars or sails. The vessel drifted and finally reached Marseille, which we know as Marseilles, where they were saved. From Marseille, Joseph and his company passed into Britain after preaching the gospel. He died there. He goes on in that writing to actually give a list of passengers on that ship. He lists them by name. And if you read the list, you recognize a lot of the names from the Gospels. They're in the Gospels and in the New Testament. Now, they reached the shores of Gaul late in the year in AD 36. And one of the legend holds that it was on Christmas Eve of that year. While Philip was sleeping, the Lord sent an angel to him and told Philip in a dream that he wanted him to take a mission party led by Joseph Arimathea across the English Channel and to go into Britain and minister to the people there. And the angel told him not to worry, that he'd be met by friends. And what this meant was that Joseph had made many friends in Britain while he was trading tin there. One of which was a family that was led by a tribal king called Bran. Bran had two sons, Avagarius and Caractacus. Caractacus had two children, Gladys, later would be known as Claudia, and Linus, who would be the first bishop of Rome. Now I'm going to this a little bit here because this is important, folks, that Paul knew these people. He talks about Claudia and Linus in one of his writings. And so the question is, how did Paul get to know these people? Now, according to legend, Joseph was well received by this family. And in fact, Brian gave him a large tract of land while he was there, just gifted it to him, and welcomed him and his party to evangelize there and preach the gospel. In fact, he converted Caractacus, he converted Brian, and converted both of Caractacus' children. Except Avagarius said, you're welcome to preach here, I won't harm you, but I ain't buying what you're selling. So, interesting. Now, this is based upon legend. And when I have something that's based upon legend or tradition, I'll tell you. When I have something that I have supported by an early church writer, father's writings, I'll tell you that too. A lot of this is based upon legends, except Cardinal Baronius does support a lot of it. However, and I say that because the Roman Church argues he never came, that Joseph never came to Britain, and this never happened. Here's what happened. A few years ago, archaeologists were digging around Glastonbury. Because remember the Glastonbury Abbey there? They found in the 12th century these two stones written in Latin. Here lies the grave of King Arthur and his Queen Guinevere. Remember that? And everybody thought, oh, we found King Arthur's grave. So then later people got to thinking it was a hoax. Somewhere around the 1000s and 1100s, people became all, obsessed with the King Arthur myths, and they were written, all we know is written by these two French authors who got tales carried from Wales. And so archaeologists thought they'd dig around some more so they could find something else, that would support that this was, where King Arthur was buried. Lo and behold, they find a foundation of an early church, the remains of a wattle and dog church, which just happens to match the description of the church that Joseph and Aristobulus were said to have built there. Didn't mean they built it, same type of church, same description, same general area. Well, they carbon date some of the stuff they find. And guess what? It carbon dated to the 1st century, within 10 years of the time period that the church was supposed to be built there. So you've got scientific evidence supporting somebody built a church there. Whether it was Joseph, Aristobulus, or whoever, somebody built a Christian church there. How do you know it's Christian? They found Christian artifacts. There was an old lamp that was there, old lamp, and it had an anchor and a hook symbol in it. And back in the 1st century, before you had the fish symbol, which is symbol of Christianity, the anchor and the hook was also the same symbol, again from the feeding of the 5 loaves. So you found this and by the way, that symbol was used in church in Jerusalem, which is where the missionaries came from. So you get very strong proof of archaeological evidence that there was a church established there. Our legend says that Joseph married. It didn't say who he married Celt or wherever, that he married, and he had a son. After his death, his son took over his ministry, and the church is there. Celtic legend also says that the King Arthur we're talking about was a direct descendant of Joseph of Arimathea and his marriage there. Simon Zelotes, who is also called Simon the Canaanite or Simon the Zealot, was called to be an apostle about the same time as Andrew and Peter. Hippolytus, who was the bishop of Rome, writes around the year 200 that he was Jesus' cousin and the son of Joseph's brother Clopas. Clopas, by the way, was one of the ones mentioned on Cardinal Baronius' list of missionaries to Gaul with Philip. Hippolytus also tells us that Simon was the first bishop in Britain. We know that early in his ministry, Simon traveled to Persia with Jude. And in fact, he was with Jude when Jude wrote his epistle. After that, the Coptic Church picks up the story and says that Simon spent time preaching around North Africa. They said he preached in Egypt, in Carthage, in Cyrene. Cyrene was a Greek outpost there in what is present-day Libya. And then they said after he finished his ministry there, he traveled to Britain. Dorotheus, who was a bishop of Tyre, writes around 300 AD. He says, Simon came to Britain after Joseph of Arimathea. And all written accounts have him first getting there in 44 AD. Both Dorotheus and Nicephorus, who was a bishop of Constantinople, say that he was martyred in Britain. The Greek Orthodox Church agrees with that and recognizes his saint day as being May 10th, which is today, by the way. According to Eusebius and Cardinal Baronius, Simon made at least 2 trips to Britain, the first in 44 AD that we've mentioned, and the second in 60 AD. Both of the times he came to Britain were times of upheaval. They weren't good times to visit. The first time was an uprising against Emperor Claudius, and shortly after that was a time when the family that I mentioned, Debron and Caractacus and so forth, were arrested and taken to Rome. That's a separate story that I'll tell sometime about how Christianity really came to Rome. But remember that because we're going to come back to those names. The second time that he visited was in AD 60, was during the Bosnian Wars. The Celtic queen Bosidicia had stirred the people up, and there was a terrible uprising against Rome, particularly in the area of Wales. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, writes about it and says it was very brutal and very cruel. He said people on both sides suffered tremendously. Well, it was on this last time that he goes into Britain, in the area that this uprising is, in what we would call Wales today. And Rome has pulled out most of its soldiers to fight against the uprising. And Simon goes in there and begins preaching very fiery sermons. He didn't learn the lesson from Matthias, who did the same thing in Jerusalem and was one of the early martyrs. He gets arrested by Catus Decanius, and they put him to death on May 10th, 61 AD. less than a year after arriving back in Britain. Cardinal Baronius confirms his martyr, as does the Eastern Orthodox Church. Also, according to Eusebius and Hippolytus, we've got someone named Aristobul, or Aristobulus, who came into Britain. Aristobulus was also one of the 70 apostles that's referred to in Luke chapter 10, verse 10. And it was said that Aristobulus was sent out to preach by Paul. He's mentioned by Paul in Romans 16:10. He's also identified with Zebedee, the father of James and John. He was a brother of Barnabas and the father-in-law of Peter. He will become the bishop of the Celtic tribe in northern Spain. And after serving there for some time, he would go on into Britain, where he would be known as the Apostle of Britain. Hippolytus, whom I've already mentioned, was a bishop of Rome. But Hippolytus heard the lectures of Irenaeus, Gallican church bishop. Irenaeus was a pupil of Polycarp. Polycarp was a pupil of John. See the connection back to John? And Hippolytus says that he was chosen by Paul to take the gospel into Britain. He ministered in today what we know as Wales, building several churches, ordaining many priests and many deacons before he was martyred. The Eastern Orthodox Church regards him as the first bishop of Britain and honors him as a saint of the Britannic Isles. So here we have, even though Rome don't recognize anybody came to Britain before the Irish, you've got the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is older than Rome, and the Greek Orthodox Church, which is a spin-off, recognizing Simon and Aristobulus as being saints of the British Isles. The Eastern Church honors his feast day on March 16th, and most churches, some churches, October 31st. I don't know what the difference is. Hippolytus writes in his Martyrologies of the Greek, he writes this about Aristobulus. He says, Aristobulus was one of the 70 disciples, a follower of Paul the Apostle, alongside whom he preached the gospel to the whole world. He was chosen by Paul to be a missionary bishop to the land of Britain, which is inhabited by a very warlike and fierce race, our Celts. By them he was often scourged and repeatedly dragged as a criminal through towns. Yet he converted many to Christianity. He was there martyred after he'd built churches and ordained deacons and priests for the island. Halakia, who was bishop of Augusta, says in his Halakia Fragmenta that the memory of many martyrs is celebrated by the Britons, but especially that of Saint Aristobulus, one of the 70 disciples. Dorothea, who we've mentioned before, the bishop of Tyre, writes this: Aristobulus, whom Paul saluted, writing to the Romans, was a bishop of Britain. Ado, who was Archbishop of Vienne in the 9th century, writes this: Bishop of Britain, brother of Barnabas, the apostle by whom he was ordained bishop, he was sent to Britain, and after preaching the truth of Christ and forming a church, he received his martyrdom on March 17th. Now the next one I'm going to read is important. Remember the Celtic family I mentioned back earlier that Joseph converted, and I said there were some of them were later arrested and brought to Rome, and that's how Christianity got to Rome, under house arrest, and later they were kind of given work release and went on the markets. Aku Pradine writes this: These came with Bran the Blessed from Rome to Britain. Aristobulus the aged, Joseph of Arimathea, Shendaf the chief or headman of Israel, Moan the son of Joseph of Arimathea, in his genealogies of the saints of Britain. He says Aristobulus was Paul's forerunner in Britain, sent by the apostle to the Gentiles to prepare his way, Paul's way, for his own mission, which was to follow later and be separate from Joseph Arimathea's work. Now, he mentions that when Aristobulus came to Britain, he came with Braun, the old grandfather that Joseph had converted. And the reason Braun was in Rome was he was arrested and brought there with his grandson and granddaughter. And the story you don't know, but I'll tell this briefly. What happened is he was sent back to Rome. We're going to keep your grandkids, so you don't misbehave. You go back and tell them that they better behave. We got him here under house arrest, and we'll kill them. You know, as an idea, away, because they were the children of tribal chieftains. And it was a way for Rome to try to put down these upbringings. So they sent the old man Braun back. And Braun goes back, according to this passage, he goes back with Joseph of Arimathea's son, somebody else from Israel, and Braun, the granddaddy of the tribal chief. Very interesting. Prydain goes on to tell us that Aristobulus labored in the part of Britain now known as Wales, in a district in the Montgomery Shire on the Severn River. Our traditions tell us that he was martyred while he was in Wales, and that his body was brought back to Glastonbury, where he was interred in the church graveyard there. Now, there's also some other legends about some other people that came into Britain. One of them involves a person named Beatus, B-E-A-T-U-S. And the legend says that Beatus is also known as Joses the Levite. And this Joses the Levite, or also known as Beatus, also visited Britain and evangelized there. And here's what's interesting about that. In Acts, they call Barnabas Joseph the Levite. Remember? Joseph the Levite from Cyprus. And so the question is, could Barnabas be the Joses the Levite that's mentioned in the legend? Saying Joses is Joseph. It would make sense that Barnabas might make it to Britain because he was the brother of Aristobulus. So if that's the case, we can mark up yet another one that came there from the 70 to minister in Britain. We have a tradition in our church that Philip also came to Britain. The tradition says he came on Simon's last trip in 60 AD along with a new group of missionaries. And that while Simon went out to the remote parts of the country, and we know what happened to him, Philip hung out around Glastonbury and ministered to the faithful there. The problem with that legend is that church history, if it's to be believed, says that Philip was martyred in 54 AD. So he couldn't have come with Simon on that trip. However, oftentimes we find that in legends and traditions there's a big chunk of truth in them and just a little bit that's not true. It's very possible that Philip did indeed go into Britain. After all, he sent a mission party there. After all, a well-established trading route across Roman roads to go into Britain, it would make sense he might go there. And so perhaps he did go with Simon, but on an earlier mission, and that the legend just has the dates mixed up. What about Andrew? Andrew was a patron saint of the Scots, right? Didn't Andrew go to Scotland? I'm looking around the room to see if anybody says it. Well, that's one apostle who didn't go there. And so then you're probably thinking, well, how come he's a patron saint of Scotland? It's because he brought his remains there in the 6th century. The king had him brought there, and he was made the patron saint. That was a trick. There are several traditions that Peter came to Britain and preached. We know that Peter liked to travel. As I said earlier, he wasn't just sitting there in Rome with a little pointy hat in his head, being a pope and pontificating to people. He got out and about. He went to Caesarea. He went to Jerusalem. He went to Asia Minor. He went to Samaria. He spent a good bit of time in Antioch. We know that he was buddies with Philip, and he got to travel with Philip. And in fact, he spent a whole lot of time ministering to Philip's churches in Gaul. So as I said earlier, if it's possible, because Philip was there in Gaul so much, and you got good Roman roads, well, if Peter's in Gaul, wouldn't he have maybe made a journey across and gone into Britain? Well, there's good evidence that he did. In 179, King Lucius, who was a Christian king, and in fact he declared Britain to be a Christian nation, the first Christian nation, by the way, in the whole world. Lucius built his first church, and he dedicated it to St. Peter. He said, in commemoration of his evangelizing labors in Britain. It was called St. Peter's of Cornhill. There's also a stone at the Whithorn Church, engraved in Latin, Locus Sanctae Petrae Apostoli. I had 2 years of Latin in high school, and I'm mastering it. But what it translates to is the place of Peter the Apostle. Aside from those kinds of things, is there other evidence? In fact, there is. Eusebius. Eusebius wrote another major work besides his History of the Christian Church. He wrote one in which he praised the life of Constantine for some reason. But it's called the Church History Life of Constantine, Oration in Praise of Constantine. He wrote it in 305, and this is what he said. He says that, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that Peter indeed preached in Britain. Peter was also said to have preached not alongside Philip, although it's possible, but with his daughter. He had a daughter named Petronilla. Did you know that? Petronilla, which is a female Roman version of Peter. And with Petronilla, he preached in Britain. Together they also preached in Gaul and Austria. Again, Bede of all people, the Roman spinmaster and apologist, confirms this. And he says, in fact, he says Petronilla preached quite a bit in Britain, remained in Britain, and preached even after Peter had left. By the way, they found, 1910, they found a tomb in Rome that's marked, here lies remains of Petronilla. And they think it's Peter's daughter. Now, as you've no doubt heard me and your bishop say many times, the missionaries to the British church came out of James's church in Jerusalem. They were the first to send missionaries to Britain and continued to do so for about 100 years, for about a century. The Gallican church, which is a Celtic church in continental Europe, mainly in Gaul, established by Philip and many others, Peter and many others, had a relationship with the British church, but because the British church was so well established and being supported by Jerusalem, the Gallican church spent most of its time in Ireland. But there was some support there in Britain. But there was a third church that gave an awful lot of support to the early British church. I should ask you perhaps to guess who it is, but I'll give you the answer. It was a church in Ephesus. The church in Ephesus began sending missionaries into northern Britain and Caledonia somewhere between 80 AD and 90 AD. Now, Caledonia is that area in Scotland just above the British border. And as an aside, I'm kind of giving you guys a lot of history today. As an aside, Scotland is basically made up of 3 tribes of people. The Caledonians, which we refer to today mostly as the Lowland Scots. Scotland today is divided into Highlands and Lowlands. Caledonians, Lowland Scots. You got the Picts, whom Caesar met and was very impressed with. We painted their naked bodies up. And the Scotai, whom names influenced the country. They were from Ireland. Scotai, Picts, Caledonians. So the Ephesian church began sending missionaries there to evangelize to the Caledonians. And today there's some Angles there, German Angles, because the Angles later came into northern Britain, while the Saxons came into other parts. So who came from Ephesus? They sent missionaries. Timothy. Timothy came. He was the first to come, as a matter of fact. Paul left Timothy in charge of the church at Ephesus in 54 AD. Eusebius says it is recorded that he became a bishop there. In AD 65, he led a mission party and brought a group of missionaries into northern Britain and Caledonia in Scotland, where they ministered. He also did something else. He brought the Gospel of Matthew with him. Now, later on, you know, or you may not know, the Gospel of John became the most important gospel in the Scottish church. But the time that Timothy came, the Gospel of John hadn't been written. And so many churches were using the Gospel of Matthew, as was the British church. Well, speaking of John, there's a strong legend, although not a Celtic legend, that John came into Caledonia shortly after Timothy. There are many people that believe that John, in fact, was a Celt. And that's why he settled his church in Ephesus, which is a Celtic province. Galatia was another one that's mentioned in the Bibles. You got a lot of Celts mentioned in the Bibles. The problem with that legend is that John was born in Galilee, which isn't Celtic. It's possible his parents could have been from one of the Celtic regions. We don't know. But so many of these people think that this was the reason that he chose to settle in Ephesus and stay there and build his church here, because he wanted to minister to the Celts. This was the reason he came into Caledonia in northern Britain to minister to the Celts, because he was one. Whether he ever came to Scotland or not, legends say he did. As I mentioned earlier, his gospel became the main gospel that was revered in the Scottish church. Now, you've heard it said that perhaps the Celtic church never put a lot of emphasis on Paul's writings. We never had anything against Paul because he ministered in Britain. But the fact is, we were long established long before he wrote his works. And as Bishop Gillies liked to say, we're Christians, not Paulinians anyway. But when the Celtic churches formed their missals, their prayer books, they had Gospels in them. And sometimes some other writings, like Acts and so forth. In the Scottish church, it would be Matthew and John. In the British church, it was Matthew, Philip, and James. Gospel of Philip and James. Gospels that we knew back then. We have our old writings refer to them, but they're long lost. Now, there are other legends that say John actually also ministered in Gaul. And speaking of which, going to where the Celts are, they say he went to Gaul because he wanted to minister to the Celts, but also for this reason. Jesus had asked him to take care of his mother Mary. And legend says that Jesus' mother fled Jerusalem with many others during the persecutions and spent a lot of time hiding out, if you will, in Gaul. Now, it may be that's why John actually came to Gaul, if he actually came to Gaul, or the legend may be confusing Jesus' mother Mary with Mary, the sister of Martha. Mary, the sister of Martha, and Martha, along with Lazarus, was on the list of passengers that came on Philip's first mission trip into Gaul that Cardinal Baronius listed. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus all stayed in Gaul. In fact, Lazarus even went farther east and established churches. If you go on the internet and try to search all this kind of stuff, Britain, who was in Britain, you'll find all kinds of stuff. What you got to do is check behind you the best you can. Lots of people write a lot of stuff just, because it supports some agenda they have. And you'll find all kinds of stories about Paul being in Britain. And the first time I heard it, I thought, well, that's just a load of bunk. Because I heard about Aristobulus and Simon and Joseph Arimathea and so forth. Hadn't heard about Paul. Because, again, according to the Roman Church, Peter goes to Rome, becomes a pope, Paul goes to Rome. And that's what you always think of, is that Paul's in Rome during that time. And so I never really paid a lot of attention to that. We've got the legends that we quoted to about Peter getting there. And if you remember the quotes about Aristobulus, several writers mentioned Aristobulus as being what? Sent by Paul as a forerunner to Paul. Remember that? To prepare the Britons for Paul's ministry. So in that sense, it would make sense that, well, maybe Paul did make it to Britain. In the Sonanini document, it's a manuscript written in Greek, discovered by D.S. Sonanini in Constantinople during the time of Louis XVI. He published it in 1801, or it was published in 1801 in London. It contains a clear reference to Paul visiting Britain. Here's what it says. And after having departed out of Spain, Paul and his company found a ship in Amorica and sailed to Britain and went therein, passing along the south coast, reaching a port called Raphinus, which is Roman name for sandwich, in Kent. Now, Amorica was a Roman name for what we know today as Brittany. It means by the sea. Its Celtic name is Arimoria. These names are hard to say, which means sky and sea. So he left out of Brittany, took a boat, went across France, left out of Brittany, took a boat, came into Britain according to this. It says after he departed Spain. Now, if you read Romans 15, Paul writes a little letter there to the little Roman church there around 58 AD. Two things are noteworthy. Number one, there's a little fledgling Christian community there in Rome, right? And Paul says, I've been delayed, I've been hindered to coming to see you. I want to come see you. But first I'm going to stop off in Jerusalem. Then I'm going to come see you and give you my support. And then I'm on my way to Spain. So you know from his own writings and the scriptures, he was going to Spain. The question is, did he ever get there? The second thing I noted was important is, where did that little Christian community come from? He's trying to. Obviously, if you read that chapter, he's never been there. He says, I've been wanting to come see you, but I've been delayed. Uh-oh, that's not what the Roman church teaches us. How did they get there? Linus and Claudia. I'll tell you the story later. Little Christian community there. He's going there to get them support. That's how he knows Linus. We know that he knows Linus, as a matter of fact, and Claudia. 2 Timothy 4:21. He tells them, he says, do your best, he writes, do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you, as do Pudens, that was Claudia's Roman husband, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers. Linus and Claudia were Britons who were converted by Joseph Arimathea on this mission. They were the son of the tribal king Caratacus. And they were the ones who brought Christianity into Rome because they were brought there as prisoners in AD 52. So by AD 58, they were out of house arrest, allowed to walk around the markets and villages. They evangelized. They preached the gospel. They got a little Christian community there. Paul is recognizing that. And he says, hey, I'm sorry I hadn't come to see you, but I'm going to on my way to Spain. Clement of Rome, who was a co-worker of Paul and the third bishop of Rome, writes this around AD 96 about Paul. After preaching both in the east and the west, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and having come to the extreme limits of the West. The extreme limits of the Western Roman Empire was Britain. Tradition tells us also that Paul spent a great deal of time in Britain and had just returned in AD 67 when he was put to death. Now when would he have gone? Well, the last writing we have of him is in AD 58. The next thing we hear is, this is according to Rome, he's martyred in AD 67. So that's what? 9 years? Where did he go? Nobody knows. And so it's very possible then, you got this 9-year gap of time. We know he wants to go to Spain. Very well, he went to Spain and to Britain. And you got several early church writers saying that's exactly what he did. But here's the best evidence he was in Britain. Now, when I was overseas studying, I took a break because when I read this, I thought, well, this can't be true. And I researched individually, every one of these quotes, I researched them independently because I don't believe anything until I see it with my own eyes. Because lots of times people quote things, and I read, that's not in there, or it's not written that way, whatever. I read this and I thought, if this is true, this is incredible. Let me read it to you. On March 27th, 1931, there was an article in the London newspaper, the Morning Post. It's since merged with the Daily Telegraph. That's how I backtracked it. And I actually found the article and read it. Because it quoted, when I read this before, somebody's writing, and they were quoting the newspaper, and I thought, are they misquoting the newspaper? Or is this a real thing? Well, believe it or not, this newspaper is on microfiche. I looked it up. The Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, Pope Pius XI, was in London in 1931 visiting church leaders there in London. He spoke before an audience of 150, according to the newspaper article. Mayors, assemblymen, all types of clergy from the Roman and Anglican Church were all present. And here's what he told them. He said, yes, Christianity came to Britain during the times of the apostles. As a matter of fact, we have evidence in our Vatican library. I quoted some of it to you that Cardinal Brownius let the cat out of the bag. But he said, Paul, in fact, did visit and minister in Britain. And we in the Vatican have proof of that. I don't know what the proof is. But when I read that, it floored me because, as I said, Rome always takes a position. There wasn't no Christianity in Britain until the 6th century. But the reason I spent time kind of pointing out Rome's hokey view of history, Peter being in Rome the same time they admit he was in Antioch, Linus, they say dying before Peter, but Linus being the second pope. I was pointing that out for this very reason. Their version of history is inconsistent as all get out. Here you've got them on the one hand officially denying there's ever any Christianity in Britain before the 6th century, and then no less than a pope says, well, wait a minute. In fact, Christianity came to Britain during the time of the apostles, and we can prove it. And then you got the curator of the Vatican Library, a cardinal, saying the same thing, and actually letting some of those writings out. And then you got Cardinal Poe, another cardinal, saying that. And then 5 papal councils saying that. It's pretty good proof when it comes from Rome that is the case. Over the next 100 years, missionaries continued to come into Britain after the age of the apostles. The reason being was it was a refuge from persecution. Britain was kind of remote, and except for the Celtic uprisings I've mentioned, it was pretty peaceful there. People just kind of let you do your own thing, and they didn't really persecute you too much. There were a couple of periods of time when, around AD 49, when there were some persecutions in Britain, when the early church first got started, but pretty much you're left to your alone. So people loved to come there and hang out and do missionary work because it was a place of refuge. So the British church got established very firmly and very quickly. And by the 2nd century, they began sending their own missionaries out. Codval, in 170 AD, is a missionary out of Joseph's Church in Glastonbury, went all the way to northern Italy, right in the backyard of Rome, and established a church. And by the way, the Celtic Church will keep doing that. Over the years, Columbanus did the same thing. The Roman Church was very weak, contrary to what they'll tell you. It wasn't until Charlemagne in the 800s grabbed all the Celtic Church property in Europe and gave it to Rome that it really became a powerhouse in terms of number of churches and territory and so forth. But There's a map I'll bring sometime that shows all these missionary branches from the British Church and the Gallican Church all the way across Europe, all the way as far as what's now known as present-day Ukraine. Remember the missions in Dalmatia, Croatia, I mentioned earlier? They went all the way into Eastern Europe. They came all the way down to northern Italy. And if you read a lot of St. Francis's prayers in northern Italy, you can tell he had a strong Celtic influence because there were a number of Celtic churches there up until the time of Charlemagne. So the missions that were brought into Britain and the Britannic Isles paid off because over the next several hundred years, they went out and spread Christianity all through the European continent.